Let's get straight into my next guest. Joining me now is Adam B. Coleman, founder of Wrong Speak Publishing. Adam, this week Americans marked Juneteenth, a holiday commemorating the emancipation of slaves in the U.S. You wrote a fascinating piece in the New York Post about this holiday, making me think about it in ways I hadn't done so before. First of all, explain to our viewers here in Australia, what is Juneteenth and how are people still living in the past when it comes to this occasion?
Sure. So Juneteenth is basically a recognition of the last slaves that were freed from the state of Texas. It was the Union soldiers that were coming to Texas to ensure that the state released those people who were supposed to be free. So it's a celebration of, really a celebration of freedom. But like you said, emancipation for, at that time, I guess, new U.S. citizens, fully fledged U.S. citizens, and no longer in bondage. So, I mean, that's the essence of what Juneteenth was, or what Juneteenth is. And it's been celebrated basically since the late 1800s, if I remember correctly. But it's been even recently, in Texas, they celebrated it. Maybe they would have, a cookout, barbecue kind of thing. So it's been around. It's not something that was just invented.
Sure, but the point I think that you try and make in your piece is that this is actually something for all Americans, and that you worry that that's being politicized by certain people on the left as a very political sort of holiday. Tell us about that.
Yeah, I think there's hesitancy for people on the right because Joe Biden put it into place, seeing that it was political pandering, racial identity politics pandering after the death of George Floyd, which I understand. I don't necessarily disagree with. But the essence of what the holiday isn't a bad thing. To me, it's very similar to faith and Christianity. Just because some people abuse Christianity doesn't mean that Christianity in itself is bad. It's the people who abuse it. So we can still celebrate the holiday without giving so much credence to the people who put it into place. In reality, they put something in place that is actually generally a good thing. It's good for Americans to celebrate freedom. We celebrate freedom all the time. And it's not in replacement of Independence Day. Independence Day was freedom from tyranny from a foreign power. And this is something completely different. So that's why, in essence, I really don't have a problem with Juneteenth.
Yeah, this is really interesting because then I'm just thinking about this, from my perspective, an American, also an Australian, a white guy, although my great-great-grandfather fought for the Union in the Civil War, so I've got some connections with that as well. What are the cultural thing around this has been that this is very much an African-American sort of holiday. Are there any sort of pushes to expand the way the thing is marked and understood? Or, is there this sort of sense that, this is particularly for this community and people should, let them kind of have this as their special event?
Well, I think it's an issue of people don't know what Juneteenth is.
Yeah.
Because it was so regional, and now it's become national and become a national holiday, a lot of people don't even know what it is. And if I'm completely honest with you, I had to research what Juneteenth was once it was being proposed as a national holiday. So I think it's really an educational thing for people to understand what it is. But I really don't think it needs to be, this is a Black holiday. It's a celebration of freedom. And I think all Americans should be able to celebrate it, just like all Americans get the day off because of Juneteenth. We get to use that time to do whatever we want. But it's a way for all Americans to kind of come together to appreciate that step forward from slavery, from our, people say our greatest sin. And there's nothing wrong with white people or anybody celebrating that holiday.
Fascinating. It's more freedom, I think, is probably something that a lot of people in America, especially on the left, need to be thinking about. Finally, just before I let you go, I want to talk about New York City and the New York City Council. They're having a big fight over the budget for the new financial year. And yet, with all the mayhem we see in New York, every time I look at the paper from back home, I see this, just complete mayhem. They're talking about defunding the police again, even though police spending hasn't actually grown. What is the left's game here? Why are they so keen to essentially let crime run rampant, especially when that crime probably affects people at the lower end of the economic spectrum the most?
Well, that you just said it right there, because it generally doesn't affect them. Um, that's the crux of all of this stuff. A lot of people have within government, and people who lobby for the government to make changes, they want changes for the greater society that don't necessarily affect them. And just like when they got rid of bail bonds, well, where did those people go? They go back into the poorer communities where they hurt the same people that they grew up around, but they don't necessarily go into the richer and wealthier neighborhoods. It doesn't really affect them. So it's very easy for someone to live in a penthouse to to decide what everybody else who lives below gets to do. But that's very much what it feels like in New York City, where you have these elitist progressives who are now in charge. You have the politicians who are maybe not progressives, but they cater to the progressives because they have a lot of leverage, and it sounds good to say these things. But in reality, I think the non-progressive politicians in New York, like Eric Adams, might go along with certain things because it benefits him budgetary-wise, and he doesn't really care ideologically. But the ideologues like it because it benefits them ideologically. So they're kind of coming together on that point.